morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, and welcome to the 14th speaker series, Cities on the Front Line, Responding with Resilience to the Coronavirus. My name is Lauren Sorkin from the Global Resilient Cities Network, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to our session on urban heat and COVID-19. We have an excellent session planned for you this evening with practitioners from The Hague and from New York who are in the thick of responding to these compounding challenges. And before I turn the microphone over to Francis from the World Bank, who will be introducing our speakers, I want to take a moment to remind everyone of the intention of these sessions. These sessions are meant for practitioners, for city officials, and the partners who are supporting them. This is a safe space, and so the sessions are not officially on the record. If you are on the call from the media and you would like to publish any of the things that you hear tonight, we ask simply that you reach out to us in advance and we'll get in touch with the speakers so that they can approve those materials. I also want to remind everyone that in order to facilitate an interactive session, we have over 400 people registered for tonight's session, which is a fantastic response. Please use the Q&A function, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. Thank you again for making time to join us. And with that, I will turn it over to my co-host, Francis.
Thank you very much, Lauren. On behalf of the World Bank Resilient Cities Program, welcome everyone. My name is Francis Guesquière. I'm the practice manager for the urban and disaster risk management practice of the World Bank in East Asia and the Pacific. As Lauren said, this session will delve on the compound vulnerabilities of communities exposed to urban heat and COVID-19. And we'll have three fascinating speakers. I think it's really going to be a really interesting session. Johanna Lovecchio from Columbia University will frame the issues and talk about the case of Tel Aviv. Anne-Marie Hitipeuw, the Chief Resilience Officer of the City of The Hague, will then talk about actions taken in The Hague and how The Hague is dealing with the compound issue of urban heat and the COVID. And then after that, Johanna and Grga also from Columbia University, will talk about the compound risk, how they have developed additional analysis and tools that can be used. Finally, Johanna will close and we will then open for a Q&A. Just before that, and as last time, as you know, we have cartoonists who have been given the presentation in advance. They've come up with a couple of interesting cartoons that we will share just before the Q&A session, just to provoke the thinking even a little bit more. So I'm going to pass now the screen to Johanna. Johanna, welcome. The screen is yours.
Hi, everyone. Assume you can see my screen. Francis, can you just give me a wave that everything looks okay? Perfect. Great. Hi, everyone. I want to thank the GRCN and the World Bank for having us, and really hope this can be a launching point for deeper conversations in the future with really everyone on this call. I'm Johanna Lovecchio. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Resilient Cities and Landscapes, and I'm joined by my colleagues Grga and Thad today. We are an applied research center at Columbia University where we work to support local governments and partners around the world in resilience project design and implementation through our Resilience Accelerator program. We do this through research, visualization of risk and scenario planning, and facilitation of workshops. Before we begin, these challenges today are frankly unlike any we've seen before, and we really want to take this opportunity to learn from you too. So please feel free to drop any ideas in the chat as we go. We really want to know, how are you identifying and working with the most at-risk communities where you are in light of heat and COVID? So as the impacts of COVID-19 are felt really worldwide, we've been thinking a lot about how to approach a summer of unprecedented heat, of storms, and many other complex vulnerabilities that will layer on top of COVID response and recovery, however long that takes. in the backdrop, through our work with cities around the world, we also often grapple with how patterns of urbanization can systematically oppress already disenfranchised people and therefore enforce social vulnerability and exposure to hazards. We grapple with a sense that the process of progress is not at pace with the urgency and dynamism of these challenges that we face. So we're exploring how to clarify communication of exposure to compounding hazards, vulnerabilities, and inequalities that have been and continue to be disproportionately carried so that resources can get into the hands of those communities. Today, we'll start with lessons from the Tel Aviv Resilience Accelerator, where we looked at urban heat in the public realm and tested applications of heat vulnerability analysis to a community design process. Then I'll turn it over to Anne-Marie, who'll talk about some of the solutions they're working on in The Hague. And we'll come back and pose a methodology for understanding compounding risks and discuss how we're aiming to support communities this coming summer. So first, a little bit about Tel Aviv. It's a growing and dynamic city that expects to increase in population by 37% as early as 2035. It's projected to get much hotter and much drier over this century, and expected to have many more days of extreme heat and longer heat waves even in the very near term. Through the accelerator, we worked across 6 municipal departments under the leadership of the Resilience Authority, the Office of the City Architect and Environmental Authority, across academic institutions, and leveraged the learnings of 100 Resilient Cities, the GRCN and C40 cities, as well as those of local designers, NGOs, and community leaders. When we began, we were building off of a city vision strategic plan, the resilience strategy, and ongoing climate action planning efforts. And our goal here was really to help advance actionable projects by layering the translation of science and design into these ongoing efforts. We started with global climate research with academic partners at Columbia and NASA, worked with the Tel Aviv University on field research, convened a design and implementation workshop, and finalized our report and recommendations. All of these are publicly available on our website, and I'm also very happy to place these resources in the chat. So recognizing the connections between community vulnerability, heat, and sustainability, we started together with a question. What design interventions can help Tel Aviv-Yafo to address urban heat in the most vulnerable communities? So we began with a citywide mapping project that spatialized heat vulnerability, understood as a function of exposure driven by the conditions in the urban fabric, as well as sensitivity factors defined by socioeconomic variables. On the exposure side, the study used remotely sensed data from Landsat 8 satellite imagery. On the sensitivity side, we used most recent census data, selecting factors associated with the adverse effects during extreme heat events in Tel Aviv, based on similar studies also in other cities. But it's complicated to work with different types of data. We're often limited by their geometries and resolutions. For example, Landsat data is aggregated into a grid, while census data is aggregated into statistical areas that vary in sizes and shapes. So we resampled the entire city into a 30 by 30 meter grid and disaggregated census data into these cells. This allowed us to layer multiple variables from varied data sets onto the same unit of that grid. On the exposure side, we looked at land surface temperature and the built-up index of the city. The areas that light up in deep red on the right are the hottest in temperature and the least green relative to the rest of the city. On the sensitivity side, we looked at factors that indicate social vulnerability to exposures of environmental hazards. As we learn more about COVID impacts, we're not surprised that some of these factors intersect with those that contribute to COVID mortality, such as elderly, lower income, large households, for example. We'll come back to this a little bit later. We put these two maps together. On the right, the deeper the pink, the greater the vulnerability. You'll notice a relative difference between the north and south of Tel Aviv. So why does this matter? Urban heat island, defined as when the city is relatively hotter than the surrounding rural area, is caused wholly by the human choices we've made in the built environment. Waste heat sources from buildings and transportation, loss of vegetation, orientation and geometry of streets and buildings, and the materiality of surfaces. We can therefore assume then that urban planning and design is not only a cause and a means of mitigating urban heat, but also a major driver of mitigating inequality through investment in communities, especially when coupled with services and wealth retention strategies. So let's look at that cool spot in the middle of Tel Aviv. This area corresponds to the 1925 Geddes Plan, designed by Sir Patrick Geddes, a Scottish biologist and planner. The plan laid out large east-west boulevards that take advantage of the climate and carry coastal breezes through the city. Large canopies of trees provide shading and cool the air as it ventilates buildings. Green spaces on interior residential blocks create neighborhood spaces for people and plants. And while it's left a legacy of cooling, it's also a legacy of privilege. This area is very wealthy, even prone to less flooding. However, this is human scale planning, and we can get back to it, and we can prioritize the neighborhoods that need it most first. So we turned our attention to one neighborhood in the south of Tel Aviv, Shapira, where exposure and sensitivity to heat is relatively high. This neighborhood, unlike that of the Geddes Plan, has lower tree canopy coverage, narrower streets, and less connectivity to wind corridors. Shapira is not just hot, but historically on the periphery. It's one of the most ethnically diverse neighborhoods and at the confluence of tensions around housing development and gentrification. Tel Aviv's central bus station, shown on the right side, is a gateway for migrants, asylum seekers, and immigrants who settle here in overcrowded apartments and often with little political or economic power. The neighborhood also suffers from conditions that can drive poor public health outcomes, like poor air quality driven by nearby industrial and transportation uses, food access, mobility and public transportation access, as well as social conflict, all becoming quite important as we reveal more about impacts from COVID-19. So we dug deeper, working with partners at Tel Aviv University's Urban Climatology Lab on a microclimate study of the neighborhood, gathering thermal imagery, measuring air temperature, airflow, radiation, humidity, and visualizing insights about the experience of heat in Shapira that we gathered through interviews. And we honestly found some alarming and, to everyone's agreement, unacceptable conditions. For one, the mat under the playground at the community center reached 70 degrees Celsius on a June morning, exposing not only a clear design challenge that's completely solvable, but also an access and health equity issue. So with the municipality, we convened community leaders, designers, academics, facilitators, NGOs, over a 2.5-day intensive workshop at the Shapira Community Center. Participants designed pilot projects and considered their implications for citywide policy. We looked at 3 sites. The first at the community center itself. Teams explored cooling with wind and shading. They looked at how stormwater capture and cooling materials could be piloted and scaled to play yards citywide. They also proposed engaging local schools through citizen science to measure outcomes, as well as pursued better connections with the local senior care facility. Another team looked at the local commercial corridor, using the east-west breezes and continuous tree plantings to create moments for rest. The concept seeks to engage local artists and the community to design the programming. Finally, the last group looked at pedestrianization of that same street, creating a cooling entrance to the neighborhood. The concept also activates the backyard spaces behind buildings to create multiple layers of cooling and connectivity. Both this project and the community center concept are now in the design development and engagement phase by a local landscape architect and the municipality. So now I'll turn it over to Anne-Marie, who will share a little bit more about what we're working on in The Hague.
Thank you very much, Johanna. Hold on. Thank you very much, Johanna. Thank you to the World Bank and the Global Resilience Cities Network for inviting me to talk about The Hague, urban heat and COVID-19. I'm Annemarie Hitipeuw. I'm the Chief Resilience Officer of The Hague. I would like to start with 2 topics of the Global Heat Health Information Network that were shared The Hague is part of the working groups on the Global Heat Health Information Network. And there are two topics that I would like to refer to. One is actions on reducing impact of heat in some cases are difficult as locations are restricted due to COVID-19. The other one, which is a very important topic, is that people that are vulnerable for COVID-19 are also vulnerable to heat stress. They are often the same groups, as Johanna also emphasized. These include older people, but also those with limited access to healthcare and those living in crowded areas and poor housing quality conditions. When you, for example, we look at the newspapers, there's a lot of news on COVID-19, but because the summer is coming up in a large part of the world, we see also the topics that heat and COVID-19 strengthen each other. And we will get into difficulties in some areas where people look for cool places in our cities that are difficult to visit because of COVID-19. In the Netherlands, air conditioning is not very common. So people would go to shopping malls, to cinemas, to cool down in periods of heat waves. This will be difficult in times of COVID-19, where these places are restricted for visiting, or we can be there with less people. What we also see, and that also was talked about by the Global Heat Health Information Network, the differences that the COVID-19 will hit more vulnerable people in our societies. And that's also where the second news article is about. It's about The Hague. And what we see that people that will get COVID-19 in places where the health circumstances are less, that the impact of COVID-19 will be heavy. What I will talk about today is the urgency of the problem. I stated it a little bit already. Then I will talk about some facts of The Hague, the response of our city at the moment on heat and COVID-19, and the activities that we take on with other cities in the Global Resilient Cities Network. The Hague, City of Peace and Justice, home to the national government, but also to international courts and tribunals. We're the third city of the Netherlands with about 550,000 people, 176 nationalities, and we're a coastal city. COVID-19 also hit our city. We have about 234 registered deaths at the moment. And we also see impact on other levels, for example, on unemployment. The unemployment rate at the moment, before COVID, the corona crisis, was about 5%. We expect it to rise in 2019 to about 9.5%, and in 2020 even to 12.5%. During the lockdown, which started on the 16th of March, and we're opening up now since June, but during the lockdown itself, we saw the decrease in visits to Scheveningen, our beach area, and also to the city center with about 80%. And also we did a survey under inhabitants in The Hague, where about 1,700 people responded to this survey. 30% of the respondents feel more fear and stress during the time of this crisis. So this COVID-19, the corona crisis, is a big shock, as it is in many cities around the world. The Hague is part of the Global Resilient Cities Network, and during the time to develop our resilience strategy, we looked at the shocks and stresses in our city. And some of these shocks and stresses are being emphasized in times of this COVID-19 period. For example, a cyber attack. We see many more attacks happening at the moment, and people are more vulnerable for it because we're all working at home. Another topic is, for example, unemployment. We see that those people in our city are being hit more, that are already more prone to unemployment, poorer people in our cities. Also, climate change, the impact on our city. We already saw that has had, of course, impact on a coastal city, sea level rise, heat waves, drought. We have a very dry spring this year, as many cities. And I would like to talk a little bit more on the topic of climate change, and more particular on heat. the Technical University of Delft did a research on the heat island effect in The Hague. And this map shows those areas that are more, become more hot during heat waves. It's the areas in the city center, as in many cities, where there are less green spaces and very densely populated. In these areas, in the heat waves during 2003 and 2006, we saw more people died. It's the black spots on this topic, on this map, sorry. And also last year, we saw 2 heat waves. And the first heat wave, there were about 400 people more that died in the Netherlands. So even though The Hague is a city in the north of Europe, we see more and more the impact of heat waves, and especially because our cities are not so developed for warm summers, people are not well prepared. Many people do not have air conditioning. The map you're looking at the moment is the segregation in The Hague. Another stress for The Hague is that we are quite the most segregated city in the Netherlands. What you look at here is the livability index. It is an index in which different indicators are shown. For example, on the physical environment, employment, safety, housing conditions. And you see some red areas showing up again in the center where people live in more vulnerable conditions. And when we compare these maps, you see when you overlay them, you see the similar areas showing up in the city center where we have more vulnerable citizens and the impact of the heat wave is large. When we then look at policy solutions that we have put in place, for example, a subsidy for green roofs, and you look at where this subsidy is being applied for, it's not in the areas where we need it most. So what we've done, we've also opened up this subsidy not only for private own, for people that own their houses, but also for housing corporations to make sure that those areas where we need green roofs can also will also have more green roofs on the housing corporation houses. What you also see is the distances to green spaces are limited in areas where it becomes hot in the summer. And another topic, going back to COVID-19, this map was made by the Technical University of Delft, showing those areas where social distancing is easy. The red areas are the most difficult areas. So again, in these areas, because there are small streets, small sidewalks, it's difficult to take the social distancing into account. So what we do as a city to respond to these challenges of heat and COVID-19, we look at short-term, medium-term and long-term solutions. On the short term, we prepare a local heat plan. We do that together with health organizations in our region and of course within our city with different departments. For the short term, this is mainly a communication plan. When our national heat plan is put into action, we also inform organizations within the city of The Hague that they need to take action and they need to inform people. What we've seen over the last years is that we cannot always reach the more vulnerable people, people that are living alone in their homes, elderly people. So what we will do for this summer is use the communication channels for COVID-19 that are put into place. Because there has been a lot of communication on how to deal with COVID-19. We will use local newspapers, but we will also use the food distribution channels that are put into place for COVID-19. Many more people need additional food, and what we will do, and our Red Cross in The Hague will be responsible for this, is to put information about heat, including in these food packages. 2 topics that we're also thinking about is to look into the Extrema app, but also cooling centers and cool streets in our city. That is something that Grga will also discuss more about how they do it in New York. For the medium term, we look into risk communication. We have held sessions, risk communication tables together with the Red Cross to inform people about the effects of extreme weather, such as heat. We've done it in such a way that we explain the impact of heat, but also we ask them to come up with ideas and to inform us on how they deal in heat waves. Do they inform their neighbors? And if they do not do it, how can they really help their neighbors during heat waves? This risk awareness training is something that we will start again as soon as we can bring people together again in a physical space. For the long term, we're looking into greenifying our city, especially in the city center. The example you're looking at here is a courtyard in the city center that we greenified. And of course, we also have a program on greenifying schoolyards. Together, to do this together with the children to also create awareness. Another program is called Operation Stone Break, where we get stones out of pavements and put green in instead. This is a program which is really also focused on private gardens. 60% of the surface in The Hague is owned by private parties. So we really have to work with people in our city together to greenify our area. And in this case, if people get the stones out of their garden, they get plants instead from this initiative Stone Break. The last example that I would like to show you is the urban water buffer. This urban water buffer has started. We started the development of this urban water buffer last week. It really is to collect the water and then treat the water, store it in an aquifer, and use it in times of drought and heat. We did this together with the neighborhood, so it really added value also to the social cohesion in this neighborhood and a beautiful park. So there's a lot of action that we can take, but there are still a lot of ideas that we would like to learn from other cities as well. So that's why we initiated a network within the Global Resilience Network of cities that all deal with heat and COVID-19 to exchange experiences. Some of the questions that came up in this network was, for example, how to promote heat safety in the context of social distancing. The second question, evidence-based research for heat mitigation in planning and design, and also promoting quick cooling options with minimal contact and environmental impact. These kind of questions are being discussed in a community of practice that we've now initiated. And ideas that will come out of it, we will share it on the website of the Global Resilient Cities Network. And we really hope to also hear your ideas and actions that you've taken as cities in your cities that we can learn from. Thank you very much for your attention. And I would like to give the hand over to Grga from Columbia University. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Give me 1 second, please. Is it okay? Yeah. Okay. Hi, everyone. So I'm Grga. I'm a research scholar at Columbia University Center for Resilient Cities and Landscapes. And today I'll talk a little bit about practical and not so practical methods of mapping compound risk. So traditionally, risk and vulnerability assessment methods only consider one driver or hazard at a time, which can lead to an underestimation of risk because different natural hazards often occur simultaneously or successively, and that can have a multiplier effect on the risk to society or infrastructure. When we talk about compound events, we usually think of climate and weather events that are interdependent and sometimes even causally related. But right now, we are concerned with COVID-19 pandemic in conjunction with one or more climate-related hazards that are neither statistically nor causally related. That makes the efforts to conceptualize, measure, and map the compound vulnerability even more complicated. There are several competing social vulnerability models, but they all share a common goal, which is to paint a social profile of communities using a specific selection of vulnerability indicators. So the heat vulnerability study that we've carried out for Tel Aviv and that you've seen is just one example of application of such model. But it's important to understand that no matter how long or seemingly comprehensive the list of sensitivity indicators, they can never paint a complete picture of community vulnerability. These are really only proxy variables assumed to represent the majority of risk factors related to a specific environmental hazard. However, there is a consensus about factors influencing social vulnerability, but those are very broad. For example, lack of access to resources, limited access to political power and representation, lack of social capital, beliefs and customs, physically limited individuals, type and density of infrastructure and lifelines, and so on. The challenge is to come up with very specific variables to represent these broader concepts. And then what do we do in case of compound events that we might be facing in the coming weeks and months, when we might see instances of extreme heat, COVID outbreaks, and potentially like hurricanes even happening all at the same time? Do we complete multiple separate studies and then overlay them? Do we go variable by variable and then assign more weight to those variables that are applicable for 2 or more hazards? Do we treat all hazards as equal in the case of compound events? And then how do we do all of that when we have an impact of a pandemic in the mix, which is conditioned on so many other factors, not the least of which are behavioral characteristics of individuals, potentially as important or more important than the socioeconomic fabric of communities. So all of this is to say that you can literally drive yourself nuts trying to figure it out. And I know I have for one hot minute, which is why we propose a radically simplified, but nonetheless robust concept of mapping vulnerability to compound events, and that is just to use land surface temperature as a proxy for community and environmental vulnerability when data and time to plan for compounding risks is limited. So to test this idea, we've started producing a series of land surface temperature maps and comparing it to other recent and historic maps of vulnerability and inequality. And I'll share some of our initial findings. So I'll start with the city of LA. So the land surface temperature map on the left is produced from a series of thermal images acquired in the summer months last year. So of that series of images. So that map is technically a composite representing the entire summer of 2019 and not just a snapshot in time. And areas that are yellow and red were on average hotter, while areas that are like green and blue were on average cooler in the greater LA metro area. And on the right is the 1939 redlining map of LA, one of approximately 200 such maps that really crystallized discriminatory housing policies here in the US. So the HOLC in the late 30s gathered data about neighborhoods and compiled the results into a rating system ranging from A to D. So much the same way we are doing today with vulnerability studies, except if you were given a low score in redlining map, you wouldn't be given a loan to buy a house. So these communities depicted in red usually contained minorities, particularly African Americans, and they were deemed hazardous for homeowners and banks. And so the impact of redlining really cannot be overstated in this country. Redlined communities fell into vicious cycle of decline because of the inability to access capital, led to additional disrepair and physical decline that can be traced to today. And we can see that on the land surface temperature map. So unsurprisingly, those that were redlined in the 30s are still the hottest neighborhoods today, and those that were given a favorable score are the cooler ones today. Another contemporary example I want to compare the land surface temperature map to is the California Healthy Places Index map. So HPI is a tool that's developed by Public Health Alliance of Southern California that can be used to explore community conditions that predict life expectancy. So that one is really concerned with health. And HPI combines 25 community characteristics that include economic, education, healthcare, environmental indicators, again, into a single indexed HPI score. And if you're going to down that road and make a study like that, I would use that as a very good example. I find it pretty impressive. It's incredibly robust. It contains an extensive support documentation. Besides just an interactive map, it includes policy guides and so on. But guess what? Like with almost no exception, the neighborhoods in the bottom 25th percentile, which is the dark blue of the map, are those that are on average hotter, while those in the top 25th percentile, which is the dark green on the map, are on average cooler on the land surface temperature map. So the next example I want to show is the city of Houston. So the land surface temperature map on the left is produced following exactly the same method as the one from LA from previous slide. So Houston is the largest city in the US with no zoning laws. And it's sort of a case study of what can go wrong if you relax regulations and let developers do what they want. The city has drained and paved over 70% of its wetlands in the past 3 decades, leaving it incredibly vulnerable to flooding, which we've witnessed in the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey in 2017. But impervious surfaces are also those that retain and radiate heat, which makes the discernible pattern of the land surface temperature on the left virtually identical to the land cover map to the right. So this correlation here is very, very evident, but also it's logical and entirely expected. The following example is the province of Gauteng in South Africa. We've chosen to map Gauteng because they've carried out one of the earliest COVID-19 vulnerability studies before they've even had 200 cases on record. And this is on the right is one of the resulting maps of that study. So it's one of the early and rare examples of really trying to map what vulnerability to COVID might look like using a set of variables. So I will just tell you what variables were selected for this study. And those are pre-existing poor health, difficulty accessing healthcare, meaning living far away from hospitals, no access to medical insurance, hunger risk, and difficulty to save money. And here I will just call out 2 moments of inequality. So the affluent and predominantly white suburb of Johannesburg, Sandton, was deemed as least vulnerable to COVID-19, while Soweto, which is predominantly Black and largely informal township in the south of Johannesburg, was scored the lowest in that study. And so obviously a lot what we're reading here could be traced to apartheid. You might ask yourself, what are these dark red and very hot areas in the south west of the province? Those are actually open pit gold mines. And so if you have like open pit gold mines in the mix, obviously those will be by far the hottest areas in the whatever surface you have. So that kind of skews the picture a little bit, but even so, you can see that like areas that are scoring lower are on average hotter, and those that are scoring higher or less vulnerable are less hotter, are cooler. The final map I want to show today is the map of Brooklyn. I live in Brooklyn, and this is the most recent map, the most recent data we could find for COVID-19 death rate. There is lots of imperfections in the data that we have of COVID-19. Many records are missing geographical location. That's one problem. Second problem is that zip codes are actually really large geometries, and they're also very weird. The way that we think about neighborhoods is Brooklyn doesn't really correspond 100% to these borders. However, even in imperfection data like this, we can see that the neighborhoods most vulnerable, such as East Flatbush, most hit by COVID, East Flatbush, Brownsville, and Canarsie were on average hotter, and the neighborhoods that were least hit by COVID were on average cooler. So just to conclude, we think that if you have time, resources, and fantastic data to engage in compound risk using multiple, vulnerability indicators, that's fantastic. It's great. Good luck with that. But if you don't, we think that land surface temperature is really a very good place to start. And I'll hand it over back to Johanna for final remarks.
Great. So I'll just take 2 minutes to just wrap it up and speak a little bit about what's happening here now. We're in New York City. So right, in light of all of these learnings, we're beginning a new process that aims to shift the paradigm of how community organizations can be better served by design and planning professionals. Through a new program called the Resilience Design Core, we're building a bench of young design talent and matching them directly with community-based organizations to prepare for a summer of extreme heat, while also deepen the response of COVID-19, as well as shifting perspectives on the role of the public realm in cultivating safety and well cared for neighborhoods, especially here in New York City. You can go to the next slide, Grga. So far, we're letting the process be guided by what we're really hearing from communities and these organizations who are often the direct service providers in COVID-19, like the food distribution, for example, and those who run social programs in the neighborhoods on a daily basis. And what we're hearing is really how can cooling be implemented as a part of this community-based programming that they're trying to fill gaps around. How to give agency to community organizations and leveraging summer street closures, which I know is happening here and also around the world. How do you mitigate for the loss of some cooling centers, and how do you address implementation needs through what is now lost summer youth employment? You can go to the next slide, Grga. And we're preparing a design kit and brief for designers. Grga, can you forward this?
Sorry, it's not.
Perfect. So as part of this process, we're preparing a design brief, which will go up on our website, which you'll all have access to, and a brief for designers that helps them better be prepared to meet the specific needs of organizations and neighborhoods. Right, overall, the goals of these projects are to be very tactical and implementable, and also designed for social distancing. Go to the next slide. To actively cool down the streets with shading from trees and from canopies. Go to the next slide. To use lightening of pavements in partnership with local artists, for example, and my personal favorite, using water, especially through fire hydrants, which is a New York City pastime. You can go to the next slide. And of course, programming, right? How can local residents activate their own spaces to play, to socialize, or just to rest? With programs that are meaningful to them and their community in a way that really reduces exposure both to heat and to COVID-19. So thank you everyone again for this time and attention. We are very happy to open it up to responses and discussion now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Grga, Anna-Marie, and Johanna. So before we move on to the question, I'm going to share some of these cartoons that we received. Actually, they were drawn by Pat Burns. Let me see if I managed to share this. I was told that I shouldn't read the caption and let you discover them by yourself. This is the first one. There's a lot of discussion on where does COVID comes from, but it may not be pangolin as people have thought. Maybe with urban heat, there's another reason. And the second one was this one. This one is quite appropriate given the recent events and the fact that we're starting cyclone season in most part of the world. Anyway, I'll now pass the screen to Lauren, who will start with the first question.
Thank you, Francis. We have a number of questions that are coming in here. And there was a lot of support for the presentations that were just made, in particular about the use of public space. On a note related to that, there was some concern about keeping people indoors and what the possible compounding vulnerabilities will be for people who have to stay inside, who are economically vulnerable, and who potentially have to bear the burden of increased utility bills and other short-term financial burdens because of COVID. So in your experiences, have you seen good solutions for vulnerable communities in trying to confront these issues? And also along the medium term, kind of a related question of, are you seeing how cities and communities are able to articulate the co-benefits to raise the priority of these types of investments which you've been showcasing for investment? I don't know if Anne-Marie or Johanna or Grga, who would like to go first? The floor is yours.
I can go first. In the Netherlands, I mentioned air conditioning is not frequently used. So increase of bills because of use of air conditioning is not so very obvious. Although we see that, as I mentioned, more vulnerable people are hit hardest by the effects of COVID-19 because they lose their jobs more often than people in higher paid jobs. So the focus in our city is also on really making sure that these people will not all lose their jobs. And there are a lot of also national programs in place to make sure that this crisis, the employment rates, the unemployment rates will not rise too much. But what we look into is a normal situation. People would go to specific places like neighborhood centers to cool down because there's often air conditioning. And we need to now come to solutions that people will be able to go to these kind of places with keeping social distancing. So it will be more complicated. But we do see that we need to take this action because we know that due to, if we have another heat wave, we need to have these places because staying at home is not an option when it's becoming so warm, especially because Dutch people in general are not used to this heat and how to deal with it. So that's why we're looking into also solutions that were presented, such as in New York. Is it possible in the open space to do more so that people can also in the open space be in places where they can cool down and increase green spaces in those areas where you need it most? So the question that you raised, Lauren, how can you also use this momentum to invest and improve the open spaces in your city, greenify the open spaces? I think we have to put that very high in the agenda to also come stronger out of this crisis by creating better and greener open spaces, public spaces.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Johanna or Grga, did you want to add on to that?
Yeah, there's a couple things I can add. One on the question about indoor cooling for those who can't go outside. In New York City, right now they're beginning the implementation of a cooling assistance benefit for eligible households, say for elderly people or those who can't go outside, which is actually a direct benefit to buy and install an air conditioner in your home. I don't believe at this time that it also comes with a subsidy for what will inevitably be a increased cost in utility bills, but there is that benefit that's getting rolled out, and I think they expect to deploy very great many of those this summer. They're also reconsidering the operations of cooling centers for social distancing. For example, how to like pace the entry and the program of those cooling centers that were already in existence, as well as opening up schools to now be cooling centers, which is something we've heard they're thinking about here in New York. And then, of course, there is this suggestion, right, in some of the work that we're starting to do about how do you prioritize neighborhoods first that you know are at risk, and sites within those neighborhoods, so that people have the opportunity to go outside if they would otherwise be stuck inside. So implementation of shading structures, for example, in the Polo Ground outside a senior care facility might make a lot of sense. So someone isn't stuck inside all day. And then the question about co-benefits is an interesting one. And I think that's why we're excited about this land surface temperature mapping, which in some ways kind of shifts this paradigm of looking, right? It starts to look at community vulnerability first, and then you can start to unpack what's possible in that neighborhood, but really starting with a root cause. So for example, if you introduce treatments that reduce heat in that neighborhood and do it in partnership with community organizations, you're then activating community service benefit and assets in that neighborhood. You may also be mitigating for flood risk at the same time, or creating better access to open space and waterfront. So we're testing with how when you start with a route, you end up getting to those co-benefits because you're prioritizing the right place. So a couple thoughts on that.
Thanks. That's a really great point as well on the place-based decision-making and co-benefits. I'm going to turn it back to Francis to ask the next question.
Thank you, Johanna and Anne-Marie. There's a lot of question about how do you get the biggest bang for the buck? What are the most efficient solutions, those that are easier to implement and have biggest impact in lowering the temperature? So maybe, I don't know, Johanna, you could start. You're talking about your new manual. I noticed you call it 6 feet apart. I hope you don't call it 6 feet under, because that would be really bad. And then a related question maybe for you, Anna-Maria, and if you can talk about the experience of The Hague, but also, are there any measure that cities can take to quickly cool particular area when there's really an acute crisis? Are there any solution that can be implemented when things really get out of hand? So, Johanna, maybe you first.
Yes. I actually can pull up a slide for this. Maybe I'll show an image. But I think there's, one way of thinking about this is what's good in the very immediate term, and then how can that actually be adapted in a longer term way. So let me just see if I can share this. So here are some like fairly tactical solutions that are easily implemented in the short term. Again, I think it always matters. The bang for your buck, I think, comes from where you prioritize first, and then building the solution from there. Some easily implementable and interesting things are installation of shading structures that can be done in partnership with local artists, for example. On the right, you'll see these shading canopies that are in Seville, Spain, that go in between the buildings. Implementation challenges there might be getting the permits in place to attach for the attachings to the buildings, which is something you might overcome, but is fairly simple to implement. There's also this really interesting project that was done here in New York and Brooklyn, where they actually planted trees in dumpsters that are movable. So, often we think about trees as, they take a long time to grow, the canopy doesn't fill in time, but this is another kind of creative solution for introducing shade in a short amount of time. This design for 6 feet is actually not our generation. You should all look it up and follow it on Instagram. It's done by some peers of ours, especially at NACTO, Designing Cities. So there is some like current thinking about how to design streets, for example, with 6 feet distances in place, just using very simple tactical, interventions on the street. Or this is Domino Park, which was in Brooklyn, and they just did that as a park operation to just draw circles on the park so that people had their own space to go to stay safe. Another interesting example is programming in schoolyards, for example, thinking about programs that kids can stay far away from each other, which is fairly easily implementable and fast, helps to get people engaged. And then, of course, I think if you do this over and over in a neighborhood, you start to see what might be possible in a longer term recovery moment. So, we're going to learn a lot when we close down streets in cities. So what does this suggest for the nature of the public realm and cooling in the public realm when the summer is over, and what we do next year? So just some ideas there.
Marie, you want to
Yes.
take over?
Yes, I will. What we've done in The Hague, in areas where there's it's a very stony area where we see there's a big effect on heat waves. We used a tool in 2 workshops called the climate adaptation tool that was developed by the University of Wageningen and Deltares. Where you can compare different measures that you can take to become a climate adaptive city. And we looked at the impact on water retention, but also on heat. And it was very obvious that interventions that you do, for example, vertical gardens, had less impact than, for example, planting trees. Or green, and one of the things that we did in this workshop was not only looking at the technical things that you can measure, like reduction in temperature and the collection of water, but we also looked at the impact on, for example, the livability of the area, the social cohesion in the area, and the solutions that worked best were really those ones put into the public space. And then, as I mentioned, trees, but also greenifying these areas really had the biggest impact on multiple dimensions. And that's what we would like to focus on. Also green roofs, of course, they can reduce the temperature, but not so much in the public space, in the temperature that people feel on the ground. So for us, in really investing in the public spaces, making those ones greener, is a very important one. And as Johanna already mentioned, planting trees, of course, will take time, but there are a lot of other solutions that you can do on a short term as well. But I think Johanna already gave some great examples. But for us, this tool really helped us, and also the designers within a city government, to really understand what the impact is of all these different measures that you can take within your city to become more climate adaptive too.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. And there are a number of questions, in fact, this week more than others, that we weren't able to get to within the time. I want to, as we close here, first and foremost, thank our speakers for being here with us. Thanks to Anne-Marie, to Johanna, and to Grga. Also, to remind everyone that Anne-Marie mentioned earlier, there is a community of practice of cities who are going to continue to share about these issues. Anne-Marie and The Hague have been active and leading in this community of practice, and there are also many others, including Janie Bavishi from New York, our Chief Resilience Officer. And so these are cities who have plans that they are sharing, not just in this forum, but continuing on through this community of practice. And so I do encourage those of you who are assigned in today and who want more information, please do stay in touch through the website and through the community of practice to continue to join us. We will be back here again at this time next week. Next week's topic is on resilient food systems and COVID-19. And we will have guest speakers from Food Tank, from the Rockefeller Foundation, and the Chief Resilience Officer from the city of Quito in Ecuador. So please do come back and join us again. Thank you all for sharing your mornings, your afternoons, and your evenings with us. We really appreciate it. Until next week, please stay healthy and stay safe.